Okay. Good evening, hello and welcome to JW3 TV. I'm Judy Trotter, I'm the Head of Education at JW3, and this extraordinary and challenging period has opened up a new world which brings new opportunities, moving our programme from a building into a global community. We're so grateful to those who have accepted invitations to be part of this new JW3 family, and our thanks to Adam for joining us this evening and being part of that new family. Tonight we're on Facebook and YouTube, and we'll be taking questions from both, so please do put them in the comments. I'm now going to hand over to Rachel Grunwald, our Director of Programming. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Judy. Chag Sameach to those celebrating Pesach. Happy Easter to those celebrating that, and a good evening to everybody. As Judy said, my name is Rachel Grunwald and I'm the Director of Programming at JW3, London's Jewish Community and Arts Centre where everybody is welcome. Our building's closed for now, but we're still very much working on our mission of raising the quality, volume and variety of Jewish conversation, connecting people and addressing the issues that most affect our community and others worldwide. And we're fortunate at JW3 to count among our friends Adam Wagner. Adam is an expert human rights and public lawyer, and it turns out that we really do rather need experts at the moment. He's acted at all levels, including in the Supreme Court and the European Court of Human Rights. Adam's well known for his human rights advocacy. He founded both the multi-award-winning human rights charity Each Other, the artist formerly known as Rights Info, and the acclaimed UK human rights blog. He's a legal commentator on social media, TV and radio, and he presents the Better Human podcast. I really do suggest that you check those out. His accolades and positions are too long to list, so here are just a couple. He's a visiting professor of law at Goldsmiths University, and this year was shortlisted for the Human Rights Junior of the Year in the 2020 Legal 500 Awards. In March, Adam was appointed as Specialist Advisor to the Joint Committee on Human Rights New Inquiry into the government's Covid-19 response. He's assisting the committee in its work scrutinising the many potential human rights implications of the pandemic, and we're privileged to be hearing from him tonight about that work. And we really did want to bring you something about COVID-19 and human rights at this time, Pesach, Passover, because Pesach is the time at which we retell and try in some way to relive and reimagine the exodus from slavery in Egypt. And as I've been telling my children, it's when we begin to understand that every human life is as important as each other, and that every life matters, and from that really stems human rights. Finally, Adam's a neighbour of mine. In fact, we're on the same road, and he's an all-round top bloke who'll always go out of his way to help others. This evening stemmed from a chance, responsibly socially distanced chat across my front garden where Adam told me what he was working on and was generous enough to offer, or to agree, I can't quite remember which, to speak to us tonight. Not a lot of people know this, but he's also a champion children's service leader, frequently deployed all year round, but especially at those high holy day dates when fainter hearts would give out in front of hundreds of babies, toddlers, and parents. And that is a great place to end an introduction for a speaker in a virtual community centre. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Rachel and Judy. It's a very lovely introduction. I'm now pleased that I gave this the address to my parents, and I hope they made it on. And if they did, they give us a thumbs up. So what I'm going to try and do this in as interactive a way as possible. I thought at first I would introduce the topic and give a few thoughts on this enormous issue of how we think about the response to COVID-19 through a human rights lens and what human rights can offer. And my view is they can offer a lot. I should point out that I'm not speaking in any official role, certainly not in my advisor role for the Joint Committee on Human Rights. I'm speaking for myself, but I'll try to give a bit of insight into what is going on at the moment. And I've got the page open, the Facebook Live page open, so I can see people's questions if you want to ask them. And if you want to ask on Twitter, then I'm using the hashtag COVID-19 that's the number 19 human rights. So I'll try once I've spoken for about 10-15 minutes to open it up if people want to ask questions. So the first question is, what are human rights, and what's the what's the reason for looking at this through a human rights lens? I was thinking about how to express this, and I think that a comparison is appropriate. And the comparison is this. When this crisis hit, the governments all around the world, in deciding what to do, certainly responsible governments, went to the scientists. And the reason they went to the scientists is because it's not just because the scientists are intelligent and good at analyzing evidence. It's that the scientists, and particularly epidemiologists, those who study epidemics, had been studying outbreaks of this kind for hundreds of years. I mean, we have hundreds of years of research. I mean, obviously, most importantly, in the last couple of 100 years, into epidemics, into pandemics. And when Boris Johnson stood up with the chief scientific advisor and the chief medical advisor in those early days of just before the lockdown started, and we'll speak more about the lockdown later, he was flanked by those two scientists who spoke about their approach. And their approach was based on research that had already been done, based on the previous SARS epidemics, swine flu, the Ebola, cholera, and they had built up this body of research that they could then apply to this crisis. And obviously the assumptions might be wrong, or they may be reassessed. The conclusions may be wrong or reassessed, but the best bet in terms of the strategy was going to the scientists. And in a similar way, when we're considering how to respond to an enormous social upheaval, something which breaks down some of the most basic assumptions that we have about how our society works and causes potentially real chaos in our interactions with each other, in the economy, in the social structures, as this pandemic does, we can look similar to, we don't look to epidemiologists to think about how to deal with the social upheaval, but human rights experts can offer some insight into what has happened in the past. And that's because human rights came out of crises. They were a response, a direct response, certainly modern human rights, to the Second World War. And in fact, really to the previous 25 years or so of the 40s, the 30s and the 20s, when the world experienced three cataclysmic crises: the First World War, the Spanish flu pandemic, which killed more people than the First World War, and then the Second World War, which brought untold suffering, tens of millions of deaths, and the most successful and extensive genocide in human history, which is the Holocaust. And coming out of that period, there was a rare moment of togetherness in the world where most of the nations in the world came together and said, well, what can we do to stop this happening again? And there were a whole range of options. There were economic options where it was posited that if you start increasing the interdependence, economic interdependence of states that have been at war on and off for centuries, particularly in Europe, then you would make war less likely. But there was also the human rights movement, and the human rights movement really came down to a simple supposition, a simple proposition, which was, in every single crisis, whether it's a war, a crash, and in fact, I didn't mention there were the fourth crisis that happened in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was the Great Depression. But we have these crises quite regularly: war, economic depressions, recessions, pandemics. These are not unusual things in human history. In fact, it's unusual for them not to happen over a number of decades rather than to happen. But when these happen, the human response, the human social response, is always the same, which is, if left unchecked, then people will turn to strong leaders. And these aren't necessarily strong leaders in the democratic sense, but strong leaders in the authoritarian sense, because people are looking for easy answers and they're looking for reassurance. And also they're looking for someone to blame. And it's interesting that when you look at cholera, there's a whole range of names for cholera, which are, you know, the Jewish plague, the Spanish plague, the Italian plague, depending on where you were. And that is, it's just human nature. Human nature is that we turn on each other and we turn on the unpopular groups in society when a crisis hits, because that is the way we are. And the idea of human rights was that if you set down in your social structure, you create a set of rights which are protected by all of the different elements of the state, particularly the parliament or the democratic structures and the courts, and ideally the culture as well, then you will make it less likely that when crises hit, that the society will turn on minorities, will turn on unpopular groups, will turn on the most vulnerable. So a simple set of rights was arrived at. And how was that arrived at? And I'm talking really about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which was the first real international agreement of rights. How was it arrived at? Because people knew from their very recent experience, you know, a lot of the people who were involved in the drafting of the Universal Declaration had very direct first-hand experience of what happened when societies completely break down. Democratic societies, you know, Germany was one of the most democratic societies. It had one of the most democratic constitutions. It was a very progressive society, but in the space of 20 years, it completely broke down to the point where it became a purveyor of aggressive war and of genocide. How did that all happen? Well, people looked at, well, what rights were taken away? The right to life, the right to liberty, to be when you have your liberty taken away, it's only done in a lawful way. The right not to be inhumanly degraded and treated, the right not to be tortured, the right to have your private life. And that was a particularly important right for the parts of Europe and Eastern Europe that had lived under totalitarian regimes where privacy was not something which any individual was entitled to have from the state. The right to freedom of speech. This was always seen as the lifeblood of democracy, because without proper freedom of speech, you can't have a real democratic conversation. The right to assemble and protest, the right to marry. These are all considered to be the most fundamental aspects of human identity, that without which, it's not quite that you can't be fully human, but you can't flourish as a human without those basic things. And the realization was that these were not to be the rights of citizens. These weren't to be the rights of the ruling group. These were to be the rights of everybody by virtue of being human. And that was a pretty fundamental change in the way that societies were organized. Now, obviously, we don't now live in there's no perfect human rights compliant society, but the idea that every individual would have equal access to important rights was something which wasn't practiced in any society in the world. And whether there was always subjugated groups, whether it was women or LGBT people or Jewish people or whatever, whoever it was in that particular society, there were always subjugated groups. So the idea was, put these rights at the heart of each society. And they would act as a safety net, so that when bad things happened or bad rulers happened, there would be some sort of protection for vulnerable groups, typically vulnerable groups. And there would also be, they would act as a warning, as an alarm system. And this is, I think, one of the most important metaphors of how you describe human rights. They are a safety net, but they're also an early warning system. I think that was the expression used by Pierre-Henri Tigenne, who was one of the founding fathers of the human rights movement. And he was a French resistance fighter. And he said, and I'm slightly paraphrasing here, but he said, you don't become a Nazi country in one day. One by one, freedoms are taken away and society is asphyxiated. And that is the progression that these people who lived through those crises experienced, and that's what they were trying to prevent. So that's where human rights came from. So the question then is, well, what relevance do they have to a pandemic? Well, we can see during this pandemic that they have a lot of relevance. So the key rights that are really important, I think, in understanding the response to this pandemic are the right to life. And it's really important to remember that the state has a duty to protect the lives of its citizens. So this isn't so there is a justification for all sorts of vastly restricting measures potentially through the right to life, because there's not much point having freedom of expression or a right to liberty or a right to family life if you're not alive, to put it bluntly. So that's a primary duty, protecting the rights of citizens. And that's why you can have a human rights compliant national lockdown in theory, because if this is a limited and proportionate approach to getting rid of a very, very dangerous disease, then that's the state protecting life. And it's not ideal, but it's not ideal because of the disease, not because of anything that human rights say. So you have a right to life. The right not to be unlawfully detained under Article 5 of, when I talk about articles, I'm actually talking about the European Convention on Human Rights now, which was a different document to the Universal Declaration, but it was very much, Britain was central to making it happen, particularly Churchill and someone called David Maxwell Fyfe, who was later to be a Tory Home Secretary and was a prosecutor at Nuremberg. He cross-examined Goering at Nuremberg on behalf of the British prosecution team, and he went on to draft or chair the drafting committee of the European Convention on Human Rights. And it still is in play today. It now protects over 800 million people. We promise to abide by its judgments as a state. So Article 5 of that European Convention is the right to liberty, the right not to be unlawfully detained. And what that says is you can be detained by the state, by an agent of the state, but only within certain limited circumstances. And that becomes extremely important in mental health settings or prison settings, where those are accepted and recognized as reasons why the state might need to detain people, but they are given certain safeguards. So that it guarantees certain safeguards. And Article 5 mentions as a valid reason for detaining someone to prevent the spread of infectious disease. So it anticipates this issue. As you would expect, the drafters in the early 1950s, who had been through cholera, they'd been through the Spanish flu, they absolutely knew that this was something which could occur, and that you would need to quarantine people. You would need to put people in isolation. You would need to potentially stop them going out and spreading the disease. So it's that. The right to privacy under Article 8 is very important in this context, and the right to freedom of assembly. So to be able to assemble, usually for reasons of protests, is something which is potentially significantly affected by this crisis. So those are the rights. I'm going to talk now about the laws that have been brought in to deal with this crisis in the UK. Now, this is a crisis which, as you know, is everywhere in the world practically, and every state's dealing with it in different ways, but a lot of states are dealing with it in quite similar ways, which is to enforce in some way either through persuasion or coercion or both, in most cases, a national lockdown. And we have a national lockdown in the UK. We have for about the last 3 weeks, we've had the state telling us we're not allowed to leave our house except for a certain limited number of reasons, which are to go out and buy basic necessities, to buy things that we need for our house, to take exercise, to visit vulnerable people, and to go to work if we cannot work from home. And that's just some of the reasons that were permitted to go out. But it's not very many, and it's certainly not anything like pre-pandemic life, as everyone will be experiencing. So in order to achieve that lockdown and to achieve success with it, the government did two things. The first thing it did was that it advised people to not leave the house except for very strict reasons. And the second thing it did is it brought in emergency laws. And there are 4 sets of emergency regulations, one for each of the different parts of the United Kingdom, which were brought in. Just to give you a bit of context, there are 2 main sets of laws. There's the Coronavirus Act, which is a 300-odd page set of all different laws, which ranging from emergency changes to the way that cremations take place and registering of deaths on the assumption there will be a lot more deaths in hospitals and around the country, which might not be dealable with by the authorities. There were in that act, there was changes to the way that social care is provided to remove the requirement for councils to provide social care to people during this period. There was changes to education to avoid the need for schools to potentially force schools to stay open to look after key workers. There was changes to the rules of mental health detention, the changes to the rules of quarantine, so that pretty much anybody any official in a hospital setting could potentially detain somebody if they were potentially infectious. And that was an act of Parliament. Now, an act like that, which is extensively changing the way that our society operates and this act lasts for 2 years with a review every 6 months by Parliament. Ordinarily, that level of social change, you would have months, if not years, of debate through Parliament. It would go through various readings in Parliament, in the Commons, in the Lords. There would be committee stages where it goes to parliamentary committees. There would be different amendments proposed, and it would take many, many months, and it would have to be very carefully scrutinized because, as every lawyer knows, even the best laws have potentially unintended consequences, and it's only through putting it through the ringer of scrutiny of experts. So, for example, with mental health detention aspects, you want mental health detention experts, organizations, doctors, people who are advocates for those groups. You want them all involved. That legislation was passed, I think, in 4 days. It went through a couple of readings in Parliament on 1 day. There were a few amendments proposed. It was all done in a few days. That's not the lockdown. That had nothing to do with the lockdown. The lockdown is done by regulations. And the regulations, if you think the Coronavirus Act went through Parliament quickly, the coronavirus regulations went through in no time at all. And I mean that literally. It was passed and presented to Parliament in the same hour. So there was no parliamentary scrutiny, and that's because they're emergency regulations. Now, the government's allowed to do that, potentially in theory, but it meant that there was absolutely no scrutiny of these regulations that are preventing us leaving the house, apart from with a reasonable excuse, preventing us gathering in groups of more than 2 that aren't people from our household out in a public place, and preventing businesses from opening unless they're on a particular list. And we can talk more. I'm happy to take questions about those regulations, because obviously they affect all of us, and it's a very for people who don't usually come into contact with the law generally, it can be very disconcerting to suddenly be not knowing whether you can leave your house without having an encounter with a police officer. So those, I'm not criticizing particularly, because these were emergency laws because we're in a very, very urgent emergency, but it does demonstrate how difficult it is to get those things right. And what does a human rights approach require? So I'm just going to spend another couple of minutes talking about this, and then I'm going to open up to questions, because I can see there are a few. So those rights that I spoke about at the beginning, and particularly the right to privacy, the right to freedom of assembly, they are rights which can be interfered with if the interference is lawful, so it comes out of an actual law as opposed to just being arbitrary. They are proportionate, and proportionality is a really important human rights principle, which essentially means that you don't use a hammer to crack a nut, that everything you do that interferes with somebody's rights, whether the right to privacy, to family life, to freedom of expression, you can do it if it's for a legitimate purpose, and protecting public health is a legitimate purpose in the context of all of the rights, which can be balanced in that way. But it has to be for a legitimate purpose, and it has to be only what is strictly necessary to achieve the purpose that you need to achieve. So it can't be more than is strictly necessary. And you can imagine that is in effect a judgment call, and it can be very difficult to assess, well, particularly in this crisis, is it strictly necessary that we need to be prevented from leaving the house? Is it strictly necessary, you know, if the government bans more exercise more than once a day, which it has in Wales, but hasn't in the rest of the UK for some reason, and it's still a mystery as to why it's different in Wales, but it is. You know, is that a proportionate response to the crisis? Is that actually going to prevent the spread of infectious diseases? There's all sorts of really important questions about the proportionality of those measures and about how they're set up. There's also really important questions about how they are enforced. And we've seen lots of reports over the last couple of weeks of police acting in a way which people feel uncomfortable with. So, you know, setting up roadblocks, threatening to check people's shopping trolleys to see whether they've left the house to buy basic necessities or they're just out for a jolly. Police, I saw a tweet yesterday of it was slightly, it would have been sinister if it wasn't also sort of quite farcical, which was a police force who tweeted a picture of two shadows of police officers saying, and the text was something like, if you're going for a picnic and you think that you're going to be not going to bump into any police, but we are patrolling the picnics, which just made me think of Yogi Bear stealing people's picnic baskets. But it's more than that. It's something which I think people are quite uncomfortable with. But you might also think, well, people are being irresponsible. They're going out and having picnics in parks and not socially isolating. Then maybe the police should be getting involved. But one of the other important elements of human rights law, which is under Article 7 of the European Convention, is that law must be clear and understandable to the everyday person. And I think there's definitely issues with the laws as they stand as to whether they are clear enough for someone to understand what they are and aren't allowed to do. Are they clear enough for the police to understand what they are and are not allowed to do? And there is a general open question about whether you can have laws in this emergency situation which are clear enough, which are predictable enough to be good laws. But on the other hand, I think a lot of people would say it kind of doesn't, it's slightly beside the point. It's all a bit technical, because what you really want to do is ensure that people don't leave the house unless they really need to. And if that means having laws which are quite severe and severe sounding, and having police that are pushing the boundaries slightly, then maybe that's it. And I think that is a debate which is sort of raging, and I've been involved in that debate in the last days and weeks. I don't think there's an easy answer, because we are in uncharted territory to an extent, certainly in modern Britain in the last 30 years. What's the answer? I'm not sure. But in terms of human rights, proportionality is a very important principle that is also a principle of good governance. And it's important to note that in the regulations themselves, there is every 3 weeks, there is a requirement by law that the Secretary of State for Health, who created these regulations, although they are kind of almost public order, not public health regulations, but they should be seen as public health regulations. The Secretary of State for Health has to review them, and as soon as they're not necessary, they have to be got rid of. So not necessarily all of them, but some of them. So the Secretary of State has to apply a human rights lens of proportionality to these regulations on a regular basis every 3 weeks. And in terms of what kind of scrutiny is being applied, well, I know that the Scottish police force the Scottish Police Association have appointed a human rights barrister to look at the police response through a human rights lens, which I think is very positive. And I think the same's happened in Northern Ireland. And here, the Joint Committee on Human Rights is running this inquiry, which is the one that I'm advising, which is a kind of a regular check and balance on the government and what they're doing. And I think Robert Buckland, who's the Justice Minister, who's also responsible for human rights, giving evidence to that inquiry to the committee quite soon. And there's a report. If you look at Harriet Harman's Twitter feed, you'll see some reports that have been published and letters over the last few weeks. But how this will all play out and how long it will last and how things will progress as the lockdown continues, which it's going to certainly for the next few weeks, it appears at least. I haven't spoken about children, how children continue to be affected by the lack of any real education apart from online, how vulnerable people who are not necessarily vulnerable to COVID-19, but are vulnerable for mental health reasons, how they're going to be, how this will compound the issues that they have. It's almost impossible to predict. But my sort of basic proposition is that applying a human rights lens can help. It's been the human rights laws are designed for these kind of situations to ensure that basic rights are upheld, to ensure that vulnerable people don't fall through the cracks, that to ensure that majorities don't use the opportunity or strong leaders don't use the opportunity to discriminate against minorities. And if it can help during this period, then it can. So if it can't help during this period, then I can't see how that approach could ever help. So that's a sort of basic introduction. Obviously, in barrister style, I went well over the time that I promised I would. I'm just going to look at some of the questions.
Shall I start with the one that came up on YouTube, Adam?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so the question is that she's interested to know what you would think about potential issues of resource allocation and application of HR.
So can you repeat that?
What you think about potential issues of resource allocation and then the application of HR.
Well, I mean, and let me try and figure out what that means. I think it in terms of resource allocation, well, at the moment it seems like there's almost literally a blank check from the government in terms of resource allocation for this pandemic. I mean, they're picking up the tab for self-employed people, furloughed staff, pretty much holding the economy up by its bootstraps as the crisis goes. I don't know whether the resource, and I presume that they'll spend whatever they need to spend on testing kits, on protective equipment, or at least they should do. Is that a human rights issue? Will it come? I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples of how it can be a human rights issue. Personal protective equipment, PPE, which has been one of the major issues of the crisis so far. It's absolutely the state's responsibility to provide adequate safety equipment for employees. That is not just a human rights principle, it's a basic principle of the Health and Safety at Work Act, which was where health and safety law comes from. There were a number of cases in the last decade that went up to the Supreme Court relating to equipment given to soldiers during the Afghanistan, I think it was the Afghanistan and the Iraq War. There was cases about the Snatch Land Rover, which was being used to drive soldiers back and forth in I think in Afghanistan, where a number of soldiers died because of improvised explosive devices that exploded under their Land Rovers. And when they exploded under the Land Rovers, the argument was that the government the Ministry of Defence should have provided reinforced Land Rovers that would have protected them against these explosive devices. And that was a human rights case because of the right to life. And the soldiers won those cases because although there's no responsibility under human rights law or any law to provide sort of perfect equipment, the top of the range, everything which could possibly be provided, I think that would be unrealistic. There is a requirement to provide what is adequate, so what is needed in the crisis. And I think we'll look back, I'm sure there'll be a public inquiry into everything that's happened, and there'll be a number of inquests as well. And one thing I didn't mention in the introduction was that inquests, which are investigations into deaths, are going to play a very important role in the post-COVID-19 investigation, if I put it like that, and reckoning, because under human rights law, you have to have a detailed investigation into any death where the state is arguably complicit. So if the state is arguably responsible, you have to have a detailed investigation, and there will have to be investigations of deaths of healthcare workers who were potentially not provided adequate kits and that sort of thing. And it may be the government has an argument that they just couldn't get enough kits because there was a worldwide shortage. I don't really know the ins and outs of it, but that's one example in terms of resource allocation. Another one which I need to declare an interest that I'm involved in a legal claim, or a potential legal claim, it's not yet a legal claim, against the Secretary of State for Education. And what we're saying, we're acting for the Good Law Project and potentially children who are not able to access online education because they don't have the resources at home because because of their socioeconomic situation they don't have the resources to have an extra laptop or an iPad to be able to provide to be able to access the online education which all the schools are recommending, and in fact the Department of Education is recommended. And now in Italy, where they've had a very similar outbreak to the one here, the government has dedicated, I think, 80 million euros to levelling up the kids who can't access the online education, so providing them with iPads and laptops or whatever they need, either by a loan or a grant. So that's one thing that we're trying to achieve here, but that's just another example of the reason that resource allocation can become really important. And there is a right to education, there is a right to provide education without discrimination.
And if we were going to take that one step further, when you were talking about the care workers, the testing kits and the ventilators, how they're being allocated. Do you have any, you may not have inside knowledge on this, you may have, but just as a general point?
I don't have inside knowledge. I've only got what I've read, which probably everyone else has read. But look, there is, in hospitals, there will be clinical decision making in relation to, and clinical prioritization, as there always is when there's difficulties with resources. And I think that probably the human rights frame can help there to an extent, because you're I think the two things that are important from a human rights perspective is you don't discriminate unless you can't discriminate. You can't say, well, because you're old, we're going to prioritize another person, a younger person over you. That wouldn't be appropriate from a human rights perspective. Now, there may be an element of, well, you can have justified discrimination. So, for example, if somebody is particularly vulnerable to dying from COVID-19, and these are incredibly hard medical decisions, but if someone was extremely vulnerable and much more likely to die, and you only had one ventilator, and another person who was otherwise fit and healthy needed the ventilator, you might, from a clinical perspective, prioritize the person who was extremely vulnerable because you're more likely to save both lives. But those are, I do think they move outside of the human rights framework. Although it can help to look through a human rights framework, and certainly a lot of medical staff do use it. But I think you're getting into very difficult sort of medical ethical situations which require also different frames to consider it through.
But I'm sure when you said about the public inquiry that everyone's talking about will happen, these are the questions that are going to happen, be really forefront, aren't they? So were the ventilators sent to the right numbers and to the right hospitals and buildings, and then how they were treated within, whether they were given to a patient who's more likely to survive than another, or I guess at some point someone will say something like, was the Prime Minister given one that could have gone to someone else? Now, we know that's not the case in this, as far as we know, that's not the case, but these are more likely to happen if the numbers keep rising, presumably. Do you not think?
Yeah, and I mean, I assume there'll be a public inquiry, because I can't think of anything. A public inquiry is intended to learn lessons, to understand what happened in an extremely important public crisis, or something that went very wrong. Something has obviously gone very wrong, in that over 10,000 people have died so far. I'm not saying that doesn't necessarily mean somebody is to blame, but something very bad has happened. So there will be a public inquiry, I assume, or some kind of inquiry. But and that will also have to interact with the inquests. There will be inquests into a lot of these deaths, and there will have to be sort of full inquests. So I don't know how that will all fit together, but they will have to look at individual cases, where things went wrong. I think there will be, my guess is that there will be a level of sympathy with the professionals, with the politicians who made difficult decisions, and I would expect there'll be an element of benevolence when considering that, because these are, this isn't a British crisis. It's something which is happening all throughout the world. Some states seem to be, at the moment, having a better approach, but who knows in a year's time what that will look like. We really don't know. But at the moment, I think what you can say for certain is there will be a reckoning, and nobody will have done things perfectly. I'm sure that's right. And you will be able to look back in retrospect and say, this is what should have happened. But that may well be the most important thing in that respect, may be to make sure that the next time this happens, we don't make the same mistakes again. And that's what the investigative obligation under the right to life, under human rights law, is all about. It's about helping the families understand what families of people who died understand what went wrong and who was potentially culpable, but also making sure that next time it happens, we don't make the same mistakes again.
So that leads us nicely on to, we've had 2 or 3 questions about how the rest of the world has dealt with human rights and COVID, vis-a-vis how the UK's dealt, and whether other countries have taken a different approach to the UK, and what you think about the relative merits of that. Huge question, sorry.
Yeah, and I might actually call pull away from this question, just because I can talk about the different approaches to law, but I'm not sure. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a politician, and I'm not sure in this, I find it quite difficult in these sort of early stages to really, and we are really still in the early stages of this pandemic, unfortunately. And we could be going on for another year and a half before there's any prospect of a vaccine, which would be the sort of potential endpoint. I just don't know whether I can add much more than people will get from just reading the news. I think it's interesting to compare the approaches to the lockdown across the world and how different states are using emergency powers in different ways. And I think I can comment on that. And I think you can see, so for example, there are in China where this started, China is a semi-authoritarian state, I would say, if not a fully authoritarian state. It's very, very different kind of state to a democratic state, in that it has access to coercive and extensive policing with no right to privacy at all, and extensive state surveillance, which we just don't have. And it's possible that makes it easier for a state like China to effectively lock down the entire population than it would be here, where it's just not quite the same. And I was reading in Wuhan, where this originated, that they were using facial recognition technology, which they use extensively in China. And they have a system of social credits in China, where if you are seen doing things which are seen as socially beneficial, then you are given credits to be able to access social services, which is quite a sort of, I don't know, I mean, people might think of that as slightly dystopian. I think there's a Black Mirror episode of exactly that kind of topic, but it happens in China. So in Wuhan, when they wanted people to stop leaving their apartment buildings, leave it at the end of their street, they had facial recognition. So if you weren't someone who's authorized to leave, you couldn't leave, and you would be arrested if you did leave. And I think that's on a different scale to what we have, the kind of state surveillance. I mean, that we have in the UK. We rejected national ID cards, and we had an enormous sort of public argument about it, just to give the level of skepticism of that kind of state intrusion that we have here. But you do see across a number of different states now. I think South Korea, in Israel, they're using phone technology to track people to use for contact tracing. And that is potentially beneficial, because it's better than, I guess, a doctor or a state official saying to you, who did you see in the last 30 days? We're going to contact everybody, which is highly intrusive. And they're proposing to introduce it here. And the proposal is that this will be an app which you download, and you consent to sharing your location constantly with some sort of server somewhere, whether it's the NHS or Google or Apple or whoever is running it. And if you are diagnosed with, or you start exhibiting the symptoms of COVID-19, then an alert will be sent to all of the people who also have consented to this app tracing their activity, and that you have come into contact with in the past few days when you are potentially infectious. And then that is a way of telling all of the people who are potentially infectious to self-isolate. And you can see the benefits of that, and you can see the potential risks of it, which is that the NHS doesn't have a very good record of keeping data private. If Google and Apple are developing that, are they going to use the specific data or the metadata to sell as products? We just don't really know. But every single state is dealing with this differently. Another example is in Hungary, where rather than having sort of limited and proportionate laws, my understanding is that the Orban government has basically said, has passed a law which allows them to do whatever they want by directive without any scrutiny at all, which is, you can imagine what kind of abuse that can be put to, particularly in a state that's moving away from democracy and the rule of law. There's a whole range of risks and benefits, but I have still basically ducked that question.
Well, we're working you hard. All right. So I think probably this will be the final question. It's also quite complicated, so I apologise. Restrictions of travel has been quite widespread, but the feeling is that the UK has done less than other countries to restrict entry coming in. what are the potential issues of human rights in restricting movement, do you think?
Well, I mean, there are, if you stop people, so if you just assume that none of us are going to be able to leave the UK for a year, and that, and I think that, well, that's probably because that would be because other countries are not letting us in rather than our country not letting us leave. But if you stop people entering the country, you're going to potentially damage the family life, interfere with the family life of a lot of people who have relatives abroad, whose children live abroad, whatever, and who go about their lives between countries. I think, as with any of the restrictions that I was talking about before, as long as the law is a proportionate response to the and logically connected to the essential reason for doing it, which is to prevent the spread of infectious disease, then it will potentially be okay. But as time goes on, it will be less okay, and we're going to get to a different situation soon. Say, for example, there is widespread epidemiological testing, so that we know who has had the disease, who has had the virus, and who is potentially immune, although I don't think we'll know whether people really are immune for quite a number of months more. Then that raises a question of, well, is the lockdown justifiable for those people as well as the people who are at risk? Is it justifiable for people who are less at risk? Will there come a point where personal autonomy becomes more important than sort of group protection? And I don't know, and I think you get into such sort of high ethics and politics that it goes beyond that human rights lens. But I think the human rights lens is a good starting point.
Okay, I'll do one final one, which is possibly slightly easier. What are there ramifications if we go as far as banning exercise, stopping people going out and having this one day walk and being able to run, cycle, etc.? What are the ramifications of doing that on human rights?
Yeah, well, I would be very upset personally, because I think I think this is a difficult one, and I think different human rights lawyers would approach this differently. But I think if the government banned all exercise for everybody, that would be unlawful. I don't think they would be permitted to do that under human rights laws. And the reason is that it would be such a blanket restriction that it would prevent even people who, so for example, people who for mental health reasons just need to get out of the house, people who are, there's been a lot of talk about people who are in violent relationships and live with their violent partners, who just need to get out of the house. They need to get out of the house when they need to get out of the house. And if they have to say it's for exercise, they have to say it's for exercise. And I think that there would be such a range. There was actually a potential legal challenge, which I think was resolved because the government changed its guidance, by the parents of autistic children who needed more than one exercise per day because for their because of their autism, they couldn't just go out once a day, and they needed regular activity. And the government changed its guidance and added an exception for that. So I think you've got to allow for exceptions. But I also think if you were going to ban all exercise, even if you allow for exceptions, so if just for somebody who doesn't for any particular reason need exercise apart from to maintain their physical health, I think you would struggle to justify, from a public health perspective, banning all exercise, because it's quite difficult to see what public health justification there would be to prevent people going out and exercising on their own and socially distancing if they're keeping 2 meters away from everybody they see, which, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I go cycling every day, and people do, so I see quite a lot of what's going on, and people are pretty much keeping away from each other. They might be talking across a hedge or a few meters away from each other, but they are tend to be keeping away. I think it goes back to that question of, well, is the measure that you're using that is restricting people's rights logically connected to the underlying purpose, to the aim, which is protecting public health? And I think you would really struggle to justify preventing any kind of exercise. And I'm not sure there is any, I'm just trying to think of any democratic states that have completely banned exercise.
So
Maybe
apparently Israel has put a distance on it.
100 meters.
I've forgotten when I asked this question, but I was speaking to someone who said they're only allowed to go, I think it was 100 meters from there.
It is 100 meters. So,
yeah.
So apparently people have been circling in a 100 meter diameter circle, but with their runs. But I think, and I also think that Israel, I mean, Israel is one of the most earliest and most severe restricted countries, and they had over the first few days of Pesach, they had a ban, I think, on people visiting anywhere, or maybe it was people just leaving the towns, but they had the even more restricted regime, and they've got this sort of complicated contact tracing through a mobile phone app as well. So, and they're also using that. I heard somebody talking about that the Mossad have, for the first time, or the intelligence services have been engaged to fulfill a public health purpose by using their sort of the intelligence they have on private individuals to trace individuals who have been infectious, which sounds really sort of a bit dicey from a human rights perspective. But Israel is its own thing. It's not subject to any international human rights treaties. Its only sort of human rights instrument is its basic laws, which is somewhere between a constitution and a not constitution. So that's a conversation for another day.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, definitely a conversation, and definitely a conversation for people who know more about Israeli law than I do. And there's plenty I'm sure you have access to, but maybe that's one to set up.
Well, thank you so much for giving us another topic. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Adam, for that thorough overview and for taking our questions. I know it feels, speaking from my bedroom just a few doors down from yours, I know it feels very strange to not know who's there with you. You handled that beautifully. And also thank you for talking to us about what happens next and about the importance of inquests and public inquiry. We'd love to have you back to take us in person through that. And hopefully that will be on our beautiful community centre in Finchley Road. In the meantime, I hope that all of you joining us tonight will look on JW3's website for forthcoming new content and interactive sessions on JW3 TV, as well as a great selection of our past highlights from our archive. In addition to bringing you our programme online, we've set up a new website called Jewish Online, where you can find all the online offerings from across the UK Jewish community, from performances to synagogue services. I'll highlight one original new programme for anybody who has small children and is concerned about the very human implications of COVID-19, as opposed to the human rights implications. And that's JW3 TV's Morning Puppet Show, in which a cast of specially created woodland characters face similar problems to those that small children are facing at the moment, gently helping little ones process what they're going through. A new short episode of that will be released every Monday. Finally, JW3 is a charity and we're offering a lot of our programs for free at the moment. If you've enjoyed this and if you're able to do so, please consider supporting us. You could do that just by checking out what else is on, or you could consider making a donation or taking out membership with us through our website. And if that's not possible, and goodness knows, we know that's not possible for a lot of people at the moment, please just tell your friends that you enjoy what we're doing and come and say hello in person when we reopen again. Finally, thank you again to Adam and thank you all for joining us. Good night.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Adam. Stay safe, everyone.